So what is the strategic purpose of a strike? From the union's perspective, a strike may be a way to deal with internal problems, to release tensions and frustrations and unify different factions, and prepare its membership for a bargaining outcome, to say, okay, here's no work and here's work under suboptimal conditions, and maybe those suboptimal conditions look a little better than no work. And again, a strike is a rallying cry for a bargaining issue. And it may be a way also, another strategic purpose is to show management that the union has strength, to convince the management that a work stoppage is a realistic consequence of not giving in to demands, and letting them realize what some of these consequences of a strike may be. So what are the consequences of a strike to an employer? Well, obviously they may be losing sales revenues. They might lose customers and a result a share of the marketplace because they're not serving those customers. They're going to lose on fixed operating costs. So even if there are not workers working, they still have to pay the rent, they still have to pay the utilities and the taxes, they still have to pay for all the debt that has been incurred for their facilities or for any other purpose. They still have to pay non-union or non-bargaining unit employees. If they are going to use replacement workers, there are costs in recruiting and hiring and training those replacement workers. There are costs to shutting down and starting up. There's negative publicity. There's legal fees. There is a long-term damage in the relationship between the employees that are striking and the other workers and the people in the business. And in general, there's an increased level of stress on employees and the managers and their families. So these are all, real costs of having either a strike or a lockout. Okay, so these are why most employers don't want either a strike or a lockout. Again, it may be the case that they don't have the choice, that a union goes out on strike, or that owners of the business say, hey, we're going to do a lockout. And so as a manager, sometimes you have to be prepared to deal with a strike and or a lockout. And so how can you minimize or limit those costs? Well, you can build up an inventory in advance. You can communicate with your customers and your suppliers to help to make alternative arrangements to meet their needs. You can engage in a publicity campaign, and you might hire a public relations firm to help with that. You can shift the work to other employees who are not part of that bargaining unit to continue to get things done however you can with the employees who aren't on strike. You can also purchase strike insurance. There's insurance for most everything. And so if you are in an industry where a strike is probable or highly possible, that might be something that is worthwhile to purchase as a business. Now, we've got to realize there are also real costs to individual employees and the union in any kind of work stoppage, either a strike or a lockout. The biggest loss is of wages and benefits. And so when workers go on strike, they're not getting a paycheck, they're not getting their health insurance, they're not getting any of those benefits. And subsequently, the union is losing its revenue through dues, because the workers can't pay union dues if they're not getting paid by the company. There are real costs to the strike, and it might be the union might pay a stipend to workers. They might even help to cover insurance in some manner, or medical costs in some manner. But those are costs to the union, and so the union has to build up a savings account to effectively deal with those types of costs. There are operating costs of a strike, and so it costs to print out leaflets and to hire lawyers and to make supplies for people on a picket line. There is a cost to the leadership if the strike isn't won. If you go out on strike and people lose their wages and it doesn't end up with a good contract settlement, that can be a big political loss to the union's leadership. Again, there can be a lot of damage between the relationships of people at work, those people who support the strike and those who don't. There can be, again, if you're not getting paid, you might be putting things on the credit card. You might be not, making a house payment or a car payment. And so those personal debts can pile up. And of course, all of this can cause a lot of stress to those people who are either locked out or on strike, and of course, their families and their communities. So what can a union do to mitigate and minimize these costs? One, you have to make sure that there's adequate support before initiating any strike. So there's always a strike authorization vote, and there needs to be a high level of support for any strike to be successful. You can solicit support from outside organizations like other unions or community groups or even the general public. There can be a way of encouraging individuals to save in anticipation of a work stoppage. There may be ways to set up credit lines for striking workers. There, again, has to be a way, a savings. There has to be what is often referred to as a war chest, a savings account that's set aside in the case of a strike to cover these costs. And again, there's got to be a public relations campaign where the reasoning for the strike and a campaign of communicating to the public why the strike is happening, that may help to mitigate some of these detrimental effects. Now, again, we have to recognize that when there is a strike, a organization, a business may decide to hire replacement workers in order to keep the business running. Now, whether the striking workers can get their jobs back is determined largely on the reason for the strike. So if the reason for a strike was an unfair labor practice, then replacement workers can be temporary, but they cannot be permanent replacement workers. Okay, and so this is often why a union will only go on strike for an unfair labor practice, and they will look for any kind of unfair labor practice, even if the unstated reason is economic. Okay, and but we have to understand, even in this event of where workers go on strike for an unfair labor practice, and then return to their jobs, they're not eligible for back pay unless their lost wages were directly due to that unfair labor practice. And again, that would be determined by the National Labor Relations Board. Now, economic strikers who go on strike because they say, I'm not being paid enough, I'm not getting good enough benefits, they can be replaced either temporarily or permanently. And if they are permanently replaced, a striker has the right to be placed on a preferential recall list to say, okay, when you start bringing on new employees from here on out, I want to be on the list and I should get preference. So that is some assistance or some kind of security, but most people don't want to be on a recall list. They want to go back and have their jobs. And they can return to work during a strike after making an unconditional request for reinstatement. So again, if there's kind of this mea culpa and say, you know, please let us have our jobs back, no conditions on our reinstatement, they can be returned to work for that reason.